During the summer of 2003, in a quiet community in Virginia, a young woman went missing without warning, and investigators had no answers. More than 15 years later, a single mysterious phone call reopened the case, and it exposed a dark secret. The city of Roanoke sits nestled in the heart of the Blue Ridge Mountains, a place defined by rolling green hills, dense forests, and a slow, comfortable pace of life. In the early 2000s, it was a community where people still left their front doors unlocked, where local diners served the same regular customers every Sunday morning, and where the heavy, humid heat of August usually kept everyone moving at a relaxed, unhurried crawl. For 22-year-old Nora Caldwell, Roanoke was a botanical paradise. She was a young woman who felt more at home with her hands buried in rich, dark soil than she ever did sitting behind a desk or walking through a crowded shopping mall. Nora was bright, fiercely independent, and endlessly fascinated by the natural world. Since she was a little girl, she possessed a rare, quiet patience, spending hours in the backyard cross-pollinating flowers and nursing sick plants back to vibrant health. She lived in a small, second-floor apartment near the edge of town with her older sister, Tessa. After their parents passed away in a tragic highway accident a few years prior, the two sisters had become each other's entire world. Tessa, who was 4 years older and worked as a middle school English teacher, was the practical and protective anchor. Nora was the dreamer, the one who filled their small apartment with dozens of hanging ferns, potted orchids, and the constant, comforting scent of damp earth and blooming jasmine. Nora had recently landed what she considered her absolute dream job. She was the lead botanist and inventory manager at Evergreen Gardens, a massive, sprawling commercial nursery located on a secluded stretch of rural highway just 10 miles outside the Roanoke city limits. The nursery was owned by Declan Hayes, a wealthy, charismatic man in his late 40s who had inherited the massive property from his family. Declan was highly respected in the community, known for supplying the city with its municipal landscaping and donating heavily to local charities. He recognized Nora's brilliant talent immediately, giving her total control over the rare indoor greenhouse, a massive glass structure that housed exotic and highly sensitive plant species. Tessa often visited the nursery on her days off, bringing Nora iced coffee and walking down the aisles of bright flowers. She loved seeing her younger sister so completely in her element. Nora would talk for hours about soil acidity, root systems, and a special hybrid project she was working on involving a rare strain of blue hydrangeas, a flower that had always been Tessa's childhood favorite. Their lives were simple, routine, and deeply filled with mutual love. There were no dark clouds on the horizon, no bitter family arguments, and no hidden enemies. Nora was simply a young woman stepping confidently into the beginning of a beautiful life. But all of that innocence was permanently shattered on the night of Thursday, August 14, 2003. The day had been oppressively hot and humid, the kind of heavy summer weather that usually preceded a violent evening storm. By 6 o'clock in the evening, the sky over the Blue Ridge Mountains had turned an ugly, bruised shade of purple. Thunder rumbled low in the distance, and the air grew completely still. The nursery closed its gates to the public at 7 o'clock. The few remaining employees clocked out and hurried to their cars to beat the incoming weather. Nora, however, decided to stay behind. The massive commercial delivery of exotic fertilizers and rare seeds had arrived late in the afternoon, and she needed to finish cataloging the inventory before the weekend rush. It was completely normal for her to work late. Declan Hayes had left for a local business dinner around 6:30, leaving Nora alone to lock up the main office and secure the heavy glass doors of the greenhouses. At exactly 8:15, the storm finally broke. It wasn't a gentle summer rain. It was a torrential, blinding downpour, accompanied by massive, booming strikes of lightning that violently illuminated the dark rural highway. At 8:30, the landline phone in the Caldwell apartment rang. Tessa, who was sitting on the couch grading English papers, answered it. It was Nora. Her voice was completely normal, entirely devoid of any anxiety or fear. She told Tessa that she had finally finished the inventory list and was getting ready to lock the main office door. She mentioned that the rain was coming down in sheets, making it hard to even see the parking lot. "I'm going to make a run for the car," Nora said, her voice sounding cheerful over the crackle of the phone line. "Can you put the kettle on? I am completely soaked, and I really need a hot cup of tea when I get home." Tessa smiled, told her to drive carefully on the slick mountain roads, and hung up the phone. The drive from Evergreen Gardens to their apartment usually took about 20 minutes. Tessa walked into their small kitchen, filled the metal kettle with water, and placed it on the stove. She pulled 2 ceramic mugs from the cupboard and set them on the counter. By 9:15, the kettle had boiled, whistled, and grown completely cold. Tessa sat at the small kitchen table, staring at the clock on the wall. A small, nagging sense of worry began to flutter in her chest. Nora was a very careful driver, but the storm outside was raging with terrifying intensity. The wind was howling against the apartment windows, rattling the glass panes. Tessa picked up the phone and dialed Nora's new cellular phone. The call went straight to a generic voicemail greeting. She tried calling the main office line at the nursery, but the phone just rang endlessly into the dark, empty building. By 9:45, Tessa's mild worry had evolved into a cold, sinking dread. Nora never simply disappeared. If she had decided to wait out the storm inside the nursery, she would have called. If her car had broken down on the highway, she would have used her cell phone. The absolute silence was completely terrifying. Unable to sit in the quiet apartment for another second, Tessa grabbed her heavy raincoat, locked the front door, and ran down the stairs to her car. She drove out of the city limits, her windshield wipers fighting a losing battle against the heavy, driving rain. The rural highway leading to the nursery was completely pitch black. The streetlights ended miles back, leaving nothing but the glow of her headlights cutting through the storm. She drove slowly, her eyes scanning the deep, muddy ditches on the side of the road, terrified of seeing Nora's small silver sedan flipped over in the mud. But she didn't see any accidents on the highway. At 10:15, Tessa pulled her car through the open iron gates of Evergreen Gardens. The massive property was completely dark, save for a single, flickering security light mounted above the main office door. The greenhouses stood like massive, shadowy glass skeletons in the heavy rain. As Tessa steered her car into the main gravel parking lot, her headlights swept across the area, instantly illuminating a sight that made her heart stop completely dead in her chest. Nora's silver sedan was parked near the front of the main office. The engine was currently running. The headlights were blazing, cutting bright white cones of light into the falling rain, and the windshield wipers were violently swiping back and forth across the glass at maximum speed. Tessa slammed her car into park and threw her door open, stepping out into the freezing downpour. She screamed her sister's name, the sound instantly swallowed by a massive boom of thunder. She ran across the flooded gravel lot, her shoes sinking into the deep mud, and approached the running vehicle. The driver's side door of Nora's car was completely wide open. Tessa reached the car and looked inside, her breath catching in her throat. The interior was empty. Nora's heavy canvas purse was sitting perfectly upright in the center of the passenger seat. Her keys were dangling from the ignition. The radio was playing softly, completely drowned out by the roar of the rain hitting the metal roof. The interior overhead light was glowing, casting a pale, eerie yellow illumination over the empty driver's seat. Panic, absolute and overwhelming, seized Tessa's entire body. She backed away from the open car door, spinning around in the darkness. She screamed Nora's name again, her voice tearing at her throat, but the nursery was a massive, sprawling labyrinth of tall trees, dark greenhouses, and endless rows of potted plants. "Nora!" Tessa screamed, running toward the main office building. She grabbed the brass handle of the office door and pulled. It was completely locked. The lights inside were all switched off. She ran to the nearest greenhouse, pressing her face against the cold, wet glass, desperately trying to see through the darkness inside. There was no movement. There was no sound other than the raging storm. Tessa ran back to the running car, completely drenched in freezing rain, shivering uncontrollably. People do not just start their cars, turn on their headlights, open their doors into a violent thunderstorm, and vanish into thin air. Something terrible had happened in the few seconds between Nora leaving the office and pulling her car door shut. Before we continue, if this story has kept you watching, please subscribe. Your support truly means a lot to us. Tessa reached into the passenger side of Nora's car, grabbed her sister's canvas purse, and desperately dug through the pockets. She found Nora's cell phone tucked inside a side zipper. It was completely dead. The battery had died hours ago, which explained why it had gone straight to voicemail. But finding the phone in the purse meant Nora had zero way to contact anyone if she had been taken. Tessa grabbed her own cell phone, her fingers numb from the cold rain, and dialed 911. She stood in the headlights of her sister's idling car, sobbing hysterically as she tried to explain the situation to the emergency dispatcher. The operator told her to get inside her own locked vehicle, keep the doors secured, and wait for the county sheriff's deputies to arrive. While she waited in her car, the rain slowly began to ease, tapering off into a steady, quiet drizzle. The violent thunder moved over the mountains, leaving the rural property in an eerie, terrifying silence. Tessa kept her high beams shining across the gravel parking lot, praying to see Nora come walking out from between the dark rows of oak saplings, laughing and explaining it was all a big misunderstanding. But the parking lot remained entirely empty. 20 minutes later, two Roanoke County Sheriff's cruisers pulled into the gravel lot, their red and blue lights flashing against the dark glass of the greenhouses. 3 deputies stepped out, pulling heavy flashlights from their belts. Tessa jumped out of her car, pointing frantically at the running silver sedan with the open door. The lead deputy, an older man with gray hair and a serious expression, approached the running car cautiously. He leaned inside, turned the key in the ignition, and pulled it out, immediately plunging the immediate area back into darkness, save for the police lights. He bagged the keys in a clear plastic evidence bag and ordered his men to begin a grid search of the immediate parking lot before the rain completely washed away any potential evidence. Tessa stood by the police cruiser, her teeth chattering, watching as the broad beams of the police flashlights swept back and forth across the wet gravel. The deputies checked the perimeter of the main office, checked the heavy locks on the greenhouse doors, and walked down the main dirt path that led toward the back storage sheds. Suddenly, one of the deputies shouted from a dark corner of the parking lot, about 50 feet away from Nora's car, near the edge of the dense forest that bordered the property. Tessa's heart leaped into her throat as the lead deputy jogged over to the area. She followed closely behind him, her boots splashing in the muddy puddles. When she reached the edge of the parking lot, the deputy pointed his heavy flashlight down at the wet grass. Lying on its side in the mud was a large, heavy terracotta planting pot. It had been completely shattered into large, jagged pieces. Spilled out from the broken pot was a massive mound of dark, rich potting soil. But it wasn't just a dropped pot. Mixed deeply into the dark, wet soil, glinting in the bright beam of the police flashlight, was a beautiful, delicate silver necklace. It was a necklace with a small, unique pendant shaped like a fern leaf. Tessa let out a broken, agonizing gasp. It was Nora's necklace. She never took it off. The delicate silver chain had been violently snapped in half, ripped completely from her neck with incredible force. And leading away from the broken pot, heading directly into the pitch-black, suffocating darkness of the deep Virginia woods, was a clear, terrible trail of dragged mud and crushed grass, disappearing completely into the trees. The sight of the dragged mud and crushed grass leading into the suffocating darkness of the Virginia woods completely paralyzed Tessa. The heavy, Torrential rain beat down against her shoulders, soaking her to the bone, but she could barely feel the freezing cold. Her eyes were locked on the shattered pieces of the terracotta pot and the broken silver fern necklace resting in the dark soil. The lead deputy immediately pulled his radio from his heavy-duty belt, his voice rising in an urgent, frantic shout as he called for emergency backup, K-9 units, and an immediate search perimeter. But as the deputy yelled into his radio, a second, incredibly violent wave of the summer storm broke over the mountains. The rain began to fall in massive, blinding sheets. The water rushed across the gravel parking lot in thick streams, flooding the grass and turning the dark soil into liquid mud. Tessa dropped to her knees in the freezing water, screaming in absolute agony as she watched the rain rapidly wash away the drag marks. The physical evidence of her sister's final moments was being erased by the storm right in front of her eyes. A female deputy rushed forward, gently wrapping her arms around Tessa's shivering shoulders, lifting her out of the mud and guiding her away from the crime scene. By sunrise on Friday morning, the violent storm had finally passed, leaving the Blue Ridge Mountains bathed in a pale, quiet morning light. Roanoke County had launched one of the most massive, coordinated search efforts in the city's history. Over 100 law enforcement officers, volunteer firefighters, and search and rescue teams descended on the sprawling rural property of Evergreen Gardens. State police helicopters flew low over the dense canopy of trees, while specialized bloodhounds sniffed the shattered pieces of the terracotta pot, desperately trying to pick up Nora's scent. But the devastating power of the heavy rain had done its terrible work. The crime scene was a washed-out, muddy disaster. The forensic technicians were unable to lift a single fingerprint from the shattered pot. The broken silver necklace, which had clearly been ripped from Nora's neck during a violent struggle, yielded absolutely no DNA. The bloodhounds lost the scent entirely just a few yards into the tree line, confused by the massive amounts of standing water. Sheriff Harrison, the veteran investigator assigned to lead the case, personally walked the path of the faded drag marks into the dense woods. The trail extended for about 200 yards through thick, thorny brush, before coming to an abrupt end at an old, unpaved logging access road that ran quietly behind the nursery property. Standing in the mud of the access road, Sheriff Harrison looked down at a series of deep, water-filled ruts in the dirt. A heavy vehicle, likely a large truck or a cargo van, had been parked on the dirt road during the storm. The terrifying reality of the ambush became agonizingly clear. The attacker had not dragged Nora deep into the mountains on foot. They had dragged her through the trees, thrown her into the back of a waiting vehicle, and sped away down the hidden access road, completely avoiding the main highway and the front gates. Because of the torrential rain, the tire tracks were completely washed out, making it impossible to identify the make or model of the vehicle. With no physical evidence left at the scene, the investigation immediately pivoted to the people in Nora's life. In any sudden disappearance, investigators look for enemies, jealous ex-boyfriends, or disgruntled coworkers. Sheriff Harrison brought Declan Hayes, the wealthy owner of the nursery, into the station for questioning. Declan arrived wearing a wrinkled suit, looking pale, exhausted, and visibly heartbroken. He cooperated completely with the detectives, handing over the keys to the entire property, access to his financial records, and the employment files of every single person who worked at Evergreen Gardens. When asked about his whereabouts on the night of the storm, Declan provided a rock-solid, completely unbreakable alibi. He had left the nursery at 6:30 in the evening and driven directly to a high-profile business dinner at an upscale steakhouse in downtown Roanoke. Over a dozen local politicians, business owners, and restaurant staff swore that Declan had been sitting at a crowded table from 7 o'clock until well past 10 o'clock that night. He was surrounded by witnesses during the exact window of time when Nora was ambushed. The detectives spent the next 2 weeks interviewing every single employee at the nursery. They spoke to the greenhouse assistants, the landscaping crews, and the delivery drivers. They scoured Nora's phone records, her bank statements, and her personal journals. What they found was deeply frustrating. Nora Caldwell was universally loved. She had no secret life, no hidden debts, and no history of drug use. She wasn't involved in any toxic romantic relationships. Her life consisted entirely of caring for her plants, drinking tea with her sister, and reading thick botanical textbooks. She was a gentle, quiet soul who had never made a single enemy. And to a seasoned investigator like Sheriff Harrison, that was the most terrifying kind of victim. When a crime has absolutely no clear motive, it usually means the attack was a crime of opportunity. A random, violent predator passing through the area who saw a young woman alone in a dark parking lot. As August turned into September, the crushing reality of the situation began to destroy Tessa's life. The small apartment she had shared with her sister transformed into a quiet, haunting museum. Tessa stopped going to work. She couldn't bring herself to grade English papers or stand in front of a classroom of children. She spent her days sitting on the living room couch, staring completely blankly at the wall. Without Nora there to care for them, the dozens of beautiful hanging ferns and potted orchids in the apartment began to wilt and die. The bright green leaves turned brown and brittle, falling silently onto the hardwood floor. One afternoon, Tessa looked at a dying blue hydrangea sitting on the windowsill, the exact hybrid flower Nora had been so incredibly proud of. Seeing the flower withering away broke something deep inside Tessa. She let out a loud, agonizing sob, grabbed a watering can from the kitchen, and spent the next hour desperately watering every single plant in the house. She realized that letting the plants die meant letting Nora's memory die, and she absolutely refused to let that happen. Tessa channeled her devastating grief into a relentless, burning determination. She took her life savings and printed thousands of missing person flyers bearing Nora's smiling, vibrant face. She organized community search parties, rallying the citizens of Roanoke to tie bright green ribbons, the color of Nora's favorite ferns, around every oak tree, street lamp, and mailbox in the city. She gave heartbreaking interviews on local television stations, begging whoever had taken her sister to please just bring her home. The community response was massive, but pure willpower cannot solve a mystery that has no clues. The autumn leaves turned bright shades of orange and red, and eventually fell to the ground, covered by the first winter snow. Weeks turned into months. The massive stack of tips called into the police hotline slowly dwindled down to nothing. The news vans packed up their cameras and moved on to the next tragic story in another town. The yellow and green ribbons tied around the city trees became faded and torn by the winter wind. By the spring of 2004, the disappearance of Nora Caldwell was officially classified as a cold case. Sheriff Harrison kept Nora's file on the very corner of his desk, refusing to put it into a filing cabinet, but he had absolutely no leads left to follow. It seemed as though the violent summer storm had completely swallowed a 22-year-old woman, leaving nothing behind but a broken silver necklace. If you want more emotional cold case stories like this, please subscribe. Your support truly means a lot to us. 6 months after that terrible night, Tessa received a quiet, somber phone call from Sheriff Harrison. He asked her to come down to the police station. When she arrived, the station felt cold and incredibly sterile. Harrison guided her into his small office and asked her to sit down. He didn't have good news. He didn't have a suspect. Instead, he slid a thick manila folder across the wooden desk. It was the finalized, deeply technical telecommunications report from the State Police Cyber Division. In 2003, tracking cellular data was a slow, incredibly complex process that required months of requesting specific digital records from massive telecommunication towers. The state police had finally finished analyzing the exact digital footprint of Nora's cell phone on the night she vanished. Sheriff Harrison opened the folder, his face drawn tight with a dark, heavy tension. He pointed to a printed spreadsheet of time codes and digital pings. He reminded Tessa of the timeline. She had spoken to Nora on the apartment landline at exactly 8:30 in the evening. Nora had sounded completely cheerful, completely normal, and had explicitly stated she was locking the office door and making a run for her car in the pouring rain. The phone company records confirmed that this call lasted for exactly 2 minutes, ending at 8:32. "When we found her car," Sheriff Harrison said, his voice dropping to a low, serious whisper, "the engine was running, the headlights were on, and the driver's side door was wide open. It told us that she made it to the car safely. She put her keys in the ignition. She was completely secure inside the vehicle." Tessa nodded slowly, her heart beginning to pound heavily in her chest. She didn't understand where he was going with this. Harrison flipped to the second page of the telecommunications report. "If she was safely inside a locked, running car in the middle of a massive thunderstorm," Harrison continued, looking deeply into Tessa's eyes, "why would she open her door and step back out into the freezing rain?" He tapped his finger against a single line of data, highlighted in bright yellow marker. The state police had uncovered a terrifying, hidden detail in the digital logs. At exactly 8:34, just 2 minutes after she hung up with her sister, and just seconds after she started her car engine, Nora's cell phone received an incoming call. The call only lasted for 9 seconds. Tessa stared at the highlighted numbers, a sickening wave of absolute dread washing over her. She realized the horrifying truth. Nora hadn't been pulled from her car by force. She had started the engine, her phone had rung, and whoever spoke to her during those 9 seconds had said something so important, or so terrifying, that Nora had willingly opened her car door and stepped out into the storm to meet them. But the identity of the caller was completely untraceable. The number belonged to a cheap, prepaid disposable cell phone purchased with cash at a convenience store months earlier. Tessa felt a sudden surge of frustration, but before she could speak, Sheriff Harrison held up his hand, signaling that he was not finished. He turned the report to the final page, showing a complex map of the local cell phone towers surrounding the Evergreen Gardens property. "We can't trace the owner of the disposable phone," Harrison said, his voice thick with a terrifying realization. "But the state police were able to isolate the exact digital ping from the moment that 9-second call was made." He pointed to a small, red circle drawn directly onto the map of the nursery. The call to Nora's phone did not come from a distant highway. It didn't come from another city, and it didn't come from the dark access road behind the woods. The red circle was directly over the massive, glass structure of greenhouse number 4. The killer wasn't a random predator passing by on the highway. The killer was standing directly on the property. They had been standing completely still in the pitch-black darkness of the indoor greenhouse, watching Nora through the wet glass as she locked the office door and ran to her car. They waited until she felt completely safe inside her running vehicle, and then, standing just 50 feet away in the shadows, they dialed her number to lure her out into the rain. Knowing that the killer had been standing inside Greenhouse 4 on the night of the storm was a massive, horrifying breakthrough, but in 2004, it created an incredibly frustrating legal wall for the police. Sheriff Harrison immediately requested a search warrant to excavate the massive glass structure, but a single, 9-second digital cell phone ping only provided a general radius. It was not enough physical evidence to convince a county judge to sign a warrant allowing the police to bring in heavy machinery and completely demolish a multi-million-dollar commercial foundation. Harrison's deputies walked through the greenhouse with search dogs. They poked the soft soil in the planting beds, and they looked for disturbed earth. But they found absolutely nothing on the surface. Without a warrant to break the concrete, Harrison's hands were legally tied. The investigation was paralyzed. The months slowly bled into years, and the painful, heavy reality of a cold case settled over Tessa's life. 15 long years passed. The world moved forward into the year 2018. Smartphones replaced landlines, the internet became a daily necessity, and the city of Roanoke grew larger and busier. But for Tessa Caldwell, time had permanently fractured on the night of that violent summer storm. She was now 37 years old. She had long ago quit her job as a middle school English teacher, finding that she could no longer stand in front of a classroom and pretend the world was a safe, predictable place. Instead, Tessa channeled her profound, unending grief into a beautiful, quiet tribute. She opened a small, independent botanical shop in downtown Roanoke. She filled the store with hanging ferns, delicate orchids, and rare blue hydrangeas, surrounding herself entirely with the things her sister had loved the most. Her shop smelled like damp earth and blooming jasmine, keeping Nora's memory alive in the quiet rustle of the leaves. Every single August, on the anniversary of the disappearance, Tessa tied a bright green ribbon to the front door handle. She never stopped hopping, and she never stopped waiting for an answer. During those 15 years, the massive property of Evergreen Gardens suffered a slow, quiet death. Declan Hayes, the wealthy owner, made several poor financial investments and eventually declared bankruptcy in 2008. The nursery was completely abandoned. The massive iron gates were chained shut, the power was cut, and the sprawling property was left to rot. Over a decade of harsh winters and humid Virginia summers allowed nature to entirely reclaim the land. The beautiful glass greenhouses became shattered, rusted skeletons, completely swallowed by thick, creeping vines and overgrown weeds. It stood on the edge of the rural highway like a massive, haunted graveyard. Sheriff Harrison had retired in 2012, handing his badge and his cold case files over to a younger generation of law enforcement. The Nora Caldwell case was assigned to Detective David Holden, a sharp, deeply dedicated investigator in his late 30s. Holden was known for his relentless, quiet obsession with unsolved mysteries. He kept Nora's file sitting right on the center of his desk, regularly reviewing the old cell phone data and the faded photographs of the broken silver necklace. He knew the answer was hiding somewhere on that abandoned property, but he needed a single thread to pull. In the late autumn of 2018, as the air in the Blue Ridge Mountains turned crisp and cold, that single thread finally appeared. It was a quiet Tuesday evening in November. Detective Holden was sitting at his desk, drinking a cold cup of coffee, when the dedicated phone line for the Roanoke County Cold Case Tip Unit began to ring. Most of the calls to this line were dead ends, psychics claiming they had visions, or people repeating rumors they had heard on the internet. But when Holden picked up the receiver and stated his name, the voice on the other end of the line made him sit up completely straight. The caller was an older man. His voice was incredibly weak, constantly interrupted by a deep, rattling, painful cough. He refused to give his name, stating immediately that he only had a few minutes to talk. "I've been carrying this for 15 years, the older man said, his voice trembling with a mixture of fear and exhaustion. "I was just diagnosed with stage 4 lung cancer. The doctors told me I have a few weeks left. I can't meet God with this sitting on my soul. I know what happened out at the old nursery in 2003. Holden immediately hit the recording button on his desk console, grabbing a pen and a legal pad. He asked the man to take his time and explain everything he knew. The anonymous caller explained that in the summer of 2003, he was working as a freelance, off-the-books concrete contractor. 2 days after the massive thunderstorm that flooded the county in August, he received a phone call from a man at Evergreen Gardens. The caller was offered triple his usual daily rate, paid entirely in untraceable cash, to come out to the nursery and perform a rush job in the middle of the night. "They told me a piece of heavy machinery had tipped over and shattered the concrete foundation pad in the back corner of Greenhouse 4, the caller explained, his breath wheezing through the phone speaker. "I drove out there at midnight, but when I got inside the greenhouse, there was no broken machinery. There was just a fresh, deep hole dug straight through the concrete and into the dirt. It was a perfectly rectangular trench, about 6 feet long and 4 feet deep. Detective Holden's heart began to hammer against his ribs. This was the exact location of the 9-second digital cell phone ping. This was the exact building the killer had called from. I knew something was wrong, the old contractor continued, his voice breaking with heavy guilt. But I was struggling to pay my rent and the cash was right there. I mixed the concrete. But before I poured it, the man who hired me walked over to the trench. He was dragging a heavy, thick black industrial duffel bag. He threw the bag down into the bottom of the hole. Then he looked me dead in the eyes and told me to pour the cement and forget I was ever there. Holden gripped his pen tightly. "Sir, who hired you? Was it the owner, Declan Hayes?" "No," the dying man whispered over the phone line. "Declan wasn't there. It was his younger brother. It was Garrett Hayes. He ran the heavy machinery division for the nursery. I poured the concrete, I took the money, and I drove away. I've been having nightmares about that black bag for 15 years. Before Holden could ask another question, the line went completely dead. The revelation sent a massive shockwave through the cold case unit. Garrett Hayes was Declan's younger brother. In 2003, Garrett had been a quiet, heavily built man who worked the night shifts, maintaining the tractors and delivery trucks. Because Declan was the wealthy owner, the police had focused all their attention on him, completely overlooking the younger brother who had unrestricted access to the property, the tools, and the greenhouses. And unlike Declan, Garrett Hayes did not have a crowd of politicians providing him with an alibi on the night of the storm. Holden did not wait until morning. He immediately called a local judge, played the audio recording of the dying man's confession, and cross-referenced it with the 2003 cell phone data pointing directly to Greenhouse 4. Within an hour, the judge signed a full, unrestricted excavation warrant for the abandoned property. Holden picked up his phone and dialed Tessa Caldwell's number. He told her to put on a heavy coat and come down to the station immediately. When Tessa arrived, she could see the raw, electric tension in Holden's eyes. He explained the anonymous phone call and the concrete trench. Tessa felt a rush of absolute dizziness. For 15 years, she had wondered if her sister was buried in the deep woods, or if she had been taken across state lines. The thought that Nora had been buried under a concrete floor just 50 feet away from her own car all this time was a horrifying, suffocating realization. A massive convoy of police vehicles, forensic vans, and heavy construction equipment rolled out of the city limits, driving down the dark rural highway toward the abandoned ruins of Evergreen Gardens. When they arrived, the property looked entirely different than it had in 2003. The police had to use heavy bolt cutters to snap the rusted chains on the front gates. The tactical vehicles drove slowly onto the overgrown gravel parking lot, their headlights illuminating a scene that looked like a post-apocalyptic jungle. The massive glass greenhouses were shattered and completely covered in thick, dark ivy. Holden, Tessa, and a heavily armed tactical team approached the decaying ruins of Greenhouse 4. The heavy metal doors were rusted shut, requiring the officers to use a crowbar to pry them open. The interior of the greenhouse smelled like rotting wood and damp, dead vegetation. The long rows of metal planting tables were collapsed and covered in dead vines. The forensic team brought in a large, wheeled machine called a ground-penetrating radar unit. They slowly pushed the machine over the cracked, dirty concrete floor, moving systematically toward the back corner of the massive structure. The only sound in the dark greenhouse was the soft, rhythmic beeping of the radar monitor and the heavy breathing of the investigators. Tessa stood near the doorway, her arms wrapped tightly around her chest. The freezing November air felt exactly like the cold, terrifying rain from 15 years ago. She closed her eyes, silently praying for the strength to face whatever was buried in the dark earth. Suddenly, the radar operator held up his hand. The beeping on the monitor changed to a rapid, high-pitched tone. "We have an anomaly," the technician said, his voice echoing in the empty glass building. "About 3 feet down, It's a massive, solid disruption in the soil beneath the concrete. This section of the floor was poured much later than the rest of the foundation. Before we continue, if this story has kept you watching, please subscribe. Your support truly means a lot to us. Detective Holden immediately ordered the tactical construction crew to move in. The silence of the abandoned nursery was violently shattered by the deafening, grinding roar of heavy concrete saws and jackhammers. The officers cut a massive square into the floor, the heavy blades throwing sparks and thick clouds of gray dust into the cold air. It took nearly an hour of exhausting, physically punishing labor to break through the thick, reinforced concrete slab that the terrified contractor had poured 15 years earlier. Once the heavy chunks of concrete were lifted away by a hydraulic winch, the forensic team stepped down into the shallow trench with small shovels and hand trowels. They began to carefully dig through the dark, compressed Virginia soil. Tessa held her breath. Her heart was beating so fast she felt lightheaded. She was preparing herself to see the absolute worst, preparing to finally see her sister's remains lifted from the cold earth. "I've got something," a forensic technician shouted from the bottom of the trench, dropping his metal trowel. He reached down into the dark dirt and pulled with both hands. With a heavy, wet sucking sound, the object broke free from the mud. It was a thick, black industrial canvas duffel bag. It was completely covered in dirt, but the heavy-duty synthetic material had perfectly resisted the rot of the earth. It was exactly what the dying contractor had described on the phone. The technicians carefully hoisted the heavy, muddy bag up onto the edge of the broken concrete. Detective Holden stepped forward, putting on a pair of fresh latex gloves. He pulled a sharp tactical knife from his belt. The heavy metal zipper on the bag was completely rusted shut, fused together by 15 years of underground moisture. Holden pressed the tip of the knife into the thick black canvas and sliced a long, deep line straight down the center of the bag. Tessa squeezed her eyes shut, terrified of seeing the physical remains of the sister she had loved so deeply. But when Holden pulled the thick canvas open and shined his heavy flashlight inside, he completely froze. There was no body inside the bag. There were no bones and there was no clothing. Instead, resting at the very bottom of the black canvas bag, was a heavy, military-grade waterproof metal lockbox. Holden stared at the metal box in total confusion. He reached inside the bag, gripped the heavy metal handle, and lifted the box out onto the concrete floor. The box was sealed with a heavy brass padlock. Holden didn't hesitate. He grabbed a pair of bolt cutters from the tactical team and snapped the lock in half. He flipped the heavy metal latches and pushed the lid open. Because the box was entirely waterproof, the interior was perfectly, terrifyingly preserved. Resting on the very top of the box was a cheap, plastic prepaid cell phone. It was the exact burner phone that had made the 9-second call to Nora's car. Sitting directly next to the phone was a set of keys on a small, familiar keychain. Tessa let out a sharp gasp. They were Nora's car keys. The keys the deputy had bagged on the night of the storm had been the spare set from the office. These were the keys the killer had ripped from the ignition. But it was what was resting underneath the keys that made Detective Holden's blood run completely cold, immediately changing the entire scope of the investigation. Neatly stacked in the bottom of the metal lockbox were dozens of clear plastic sleeves. Inside the sleeves was a massive collection of perfectly preserved, highly detailed Polaroid photographs. Holden carefully picked up the first photograph. He shined his flashlight on the glossy image. It was a picture of Nora Caldwell. She was unconscious, her hands and feet bound with heavy plastic zip ties, lying on the floor of a dark, unfamiliar basement room with cinderblock walls. Holden quickly flipped to the second photograph. It was a picture of a different young woman, completely unfamiliar to the police, bound in the exact same way in the exact same basement room. He flipped to the third photograph, and then the fourth. Every single picture showed a different young woman, all held captive in the same terrifying cinderblock room. The concrete trench in Greenhouse 4 was not a grave. It was a secret, hidden trophy vault. Garrett Hayes had buried his horrifying collection of evidence deep under the earth to ensure no one would ever find it. But looking closely at the background of the very last photograph in the stack, Detective Holden noticed a highly specific, undeniable detail painted onto the cinderblock wall that completely exposed the monster's true location. Detective Holden held the final Polaroid photograph inches from his face, the bright beam of his flashlight illuminating the glossy surface. His eyes moved past the terrifying image of the bound, unconscious young woman in the foreground and locked onto the dark cinderblock wall directly behind her. Painted in thick, peeling yellow letters near the top of the concrete wall was a distinct, heavily faded municipal stencil. It read, Roanoke County Civil Defense, Shelter Number 7. Holden felt a massive, electric jolt of adrenaline shoot through his entire body. He immediately handed the photograph to the lead forensic technician, ordering him to secure the metal lockbox and its horrifying contents with extreme care. He turned to Tessa, who was standing near the edge of the broken concrete trench. She was completely pale, trembling violently in the freezing November air. She had seen enough of the photographs to realize that her sister was not the victim of a random, panicked accident. Nora had been hunted by a highly organized, deeply sadistic serial predator who had been operating in the shadows of their quiet city for years. Holden gently placed his hands on Tessa's shoulders, his voice low and incredibly urgent. He told her they needed to leave the abandoned nursery right now and head straight back to the police station. The discovery of the photographs changed everything. This was no longer just a cold case excavation. It was an active, massive manhunt for a monster who might still be holding people in the dark. The drive back to the Roanoke police precinct was a blur of flashing lights and heavy, suffocating silence. Tessa sat in the passenger seat of Holden's unmarked cruiser, staring out the window at the dark mountains. For 15 years, she had imagined 1,000 different scenarios, but the reality was infinitely more terrifying. Garrett Hayes, the quiet mechanic who had maintained the delivery trucks at the nursery, had built a secret, underground nightmare. And he had buried the only evidence of his crimes deep beneath a concrete floor, confident that no one would ever find it. When they arrived at the precinct, it was 3 in the morning. The building was usually quiet at this hour, but Holden's radio calls from the nursery had completely mobilized the entire department. The bullpen was swarming with detectives, tactical officers, and forensic analysts. Holden led Tessa into a quiet briefing room, bringing her a hot cup of coffee and wrapping a thick blanket around her shoulders. He promised her that he would not sleep, he would not eat, and he would not stop until he found exactly where Garrett Hayes had taken her sister. Holden rushed into the Municipal Records Department. In the early 1960s, during the height of the Cold War, the local government had built a network of deep, reinforced concrete fallout shelters hidden throughout the Appalachian Mountains. By the late 1980s, the shelters were considered obsolete. The county decommissioned them, emptied the supplies, and quietly sold the remote parcels of land to private buyers at public auctions. Holden and 2 junior detectives desperately tore through the dusty, heavy municipal ledgers from the county archives. They needed to find the exact geographical coordinates of shelter number 7, and more importantly, they needed to find out who purchased the land. After 45 agonizing minutes of scanning through faded property deeds, a young detective shouted from the corner of the room. He slammed his finger down on a yellowed ledger from 1998. The 20-acre plot of heavily forested, undeveloped mountain land containing shelter number 7 had been purchased by a private, anonymous shell company called Blue Ridge Holdings. But when the detectives ran the tax identification number for the shell company through the state financial database, the ultimate registered owner was completely exposed. The sole owner of the land was Garrett Hayes. Holden grabbed the property map, his mind racing as the dark, terrifying brilliance of the predator's plan became completely clear. Garrett had purposely bought an isolated, bomb-proof underground bunker surrounded by miles of empty woods. The walls were several feet thick, designed to withstand a nuclear blast, meaning they were entirely soundproof. He had a private, inescapable fortress where he could take his victims, completely hidden from the rest of the world. And because the land was registered under a fake company name, the police in 2003 had absolutely no reason to search the remote mountain property. Holden ran the current database to find Garrett Hayes' active address. To his absolute disgust, Garrett was not hiding. He was living a perfectly normal, quiet life in a suburban neighborhood just 10 miles away from the precinct. He was 60 years old now, working as an independent mechanic, blending in perfectly with the rest of society. He mowed his lawn, waved to his neighbors, and went to the grocery store, completely hiding the monster that lived just beneath the surface. The police captain ordered a massive, coordinated strike. They would send a team of heavily armed officers to Garrett's suburban home to arrest him immediately. But Detective Holden knew that arresting the man was only half the battle. They needed to secure the underground bunker right now. They needed to find out what Garrett had been doing in the dark for the last 15 years. Tessa stood up from the table in the briefing room as Holden walked in wearing a heavy, dark tactical vest. She saw the intense, determined look in his eyes and immediately knew they had found the location. She grabbed his arm, begging to go with them. Holden gently but firmly refused. He told her that a tactical raid on an underground bunker was incredibly dangerous, and he could not risk her life. He promised to call her the absolute second they opened the heavy steel door. Tessa reluctantly agreed, sinking back into her chair, her heart pounding with a terrifying mixture of hope and pure dread. At exactly 4:30 in the morning, under the cover of absolute darkness, a convoy of black tactical vehicles rolled silently out of the Roanoke precinct. They drove out of the city limits, heading deep into the steep, winding roads of the Blue Ridge Mountains. The temperature had dropped below freezing, and a thick, heavy layer of mountain fog had settled over the dense pine forests. The drive took nearly an hour. The tactical vehicles turned off the paved highway and slowly navigated up a rugged, unpaved logging trail that hadn't been maintained in decades. The heavy tires crunched quietly over the frozen mud and dead leaves. About a mile into the woods, the trail simply ended at a steep, rocky incline. The team would have to cover the final half-mile on foot. Detective Holden and 12 heavily armed SWAT officers stepped out of the vehicles. They used red-lens tactical flashlights to preserve their night vision, moving silently in a specialized tactical formation through the freezing, foggy woods. The silence of the mountain was absolute, broken only by the sound of their heavy boots crunching against the frost-covered ground. As they crested the top of a steep ridge, the lead officer held up his fist, signaling the team to halt. Holden crept forward, peering through the thick brush. Sitting in the center of a small, natural clearing was a large, flat concrete slab, completely covered in thick camouflage netting, dead pine branches, and decades of overgrown moss. If a hiker had somehow wandered off the trail and walked right past it, they would have assumed it was just a natural rock formation. But the trained eyes of the tactical team saw the unnatural, perfect square edges of the structure. This was shelter number 7. The team moved swiftly and silently across the clearing. They pulled back the heavy, wet camouflage netting, exposing a set of steep concrete stairs leading down into the earth. At the bottom of the narrow stairwell was a massive, incredibly heavy, solid steel blast door. It was deeply rusted around the edges, but the center of the door was secured by 3 massive, modern, heavy-duty commercial padlocks. Holden felt a cold shiver run down his spine. The padlocks were heavily oiled and completely free of rust. They were brand new. That meant Garrett Hayes had not abandoned this bunker. He was actively maintaining it. He was still using it. The tactical breacher stepped forward, carrying a set of massive, heavy hydraulic bolt cutters. He slid the thick metal jaws around the first steel padlock. With a loud, sharp crack that echoed up out of the stairwell, the lock snapped in half and clattered against the concrete. The breacher quickly snapped the second lock, and then the third. The heavy steel door was completely unsealed. Holden drew his service weapon, his breathing steady but his heart racing. He nodded to the tactical team. Two massive officers grabbed the heavy, rusted iron handle of the blast door. They planted their boots against the concrete wall and pulled with all of their combined strength. With a loud, grinding screech of protesting metal, the heavy steel door slowly swung open, exposing the absolute, pitch-black darkness of the underground bunker. A rush of incredibly stale, freezing air blew out of the dark void, smelling of damp concrete, old rust, and deep earth. The tactical officers immediately raised their heavy flashlights, cutting blinding white beams of light into the total darkness. The long, narrow concrete hallway of the bunker stretched out in front of them, disappearing into the shadows. The walls were exactly the same as the ones in the Polaroid photographs. Holden took a slow, cautious step into the bunker, his weapon raised, his eyes scanning the empty, quiet hallway. The silence inside the underground shelter was incredibly heavy, almost suffocating. But as Holden took his second step onto the cold concrete floor, every single officer in the tactical unit instantly froze. Echoing from the very back of the dark, underground bunker, coming from behind a closed metal door at the end of the long hallway, they heard a sound. It was faint, it was incredibly weak, but in the absolute silence of the underground concrete vault, the sound was completely, undeniably clear. Someone was rhythmically, desperately tapping against the inside of the metal door. The faint, rhythmic tapping echoing down the pitch-black concrete hallway of the underground bunker stopped every single tactical officer completely in their tracks. It was a weak, hollow sound, metal striking against metal, but in the absolute, suffocating silence of the fallout shelter, it was the loudest noise Detective Holden had ever heard in his life. Holden felt a massive, electric jolt of adrenaline flood his veins. He raised his hand, signaling the heavily armed SWAT team to move forward with extreme caution. They navigated the long, narrow corridor, their red tactical lights sweeping over the thick cinderblock walls. The air grew colder the deeper they went, smelling of stale dust, damp earth, and chemical cleaner. At the very end of the hallway stood a heavy, solid steel containment door, originally designed to protect the shelter's occupants from nuclear fallout. The tapping sound was coming from directly behind that door. Holden approached the heavy steel frame. There was a small, thick glass observation window near the top of the door, but it had been completely painted over from the outside with thick, black industrial paint, ensuring absolutely no light could ever enter or escape the room. The door was secured by a heavy external sliding deadbolt. Holden holstered his weapon. He took a deep, shaky breath, raised his fist, and banged heavily on the solid steel. "Roanoke County Police," Holden shouted, his voice booming like thunder in the concrete corridor. "Is there someone in there?" For a terrifying, agonizing moment, there was absolutely no response. And then a voice answered. It was incredibly faint, raspy, and completely broken from years of disuse. It was the voice of a woman who had not spoken above a terrified whisper in a very long time. "Please," the voice begged from the other side of the steel door. "Please, don't turn off the lights." Holden didn't wait another second. He grabbed the heavy metal handle of the sliding deadbolt and ripped it backward. He threw his entire shoulder against the freezing steel door and pushed it open. The tactical officers rushed in, their bright white flashlights cutting through the darkness. The room was a small, 10 by 10 concrete cell. The walls were exactly the same as the ones seen in the horrifying Polaroid photographs. In the corner of the room was a small, stained mattress, a bucket, and a few scattered plastic water bottles. Sitting on the edge of the mattress, shielding her eyes from the blinding glare of the police flashlights, was a woman. She was incredibly frail, her skin a pale, ghostly white from severe lack of sunlight. She was wearing oversized, faded gray sweatpants and a frayed sweater. Her dark hair was long, untidy, and heavily streaked with premature silver. She held a small, rusted metal spoon in her trembling hand, the tool she had been using to desperately tap against the heavy steel door when she heard the heavy footsteps in the hallway. Holden slowly lowered his flashlight, pointing the beam at the floor so he wouldn't blind her. He stepped forward, taking off his heavy tactical helmet so she could see his face clearly. "Ma'am," Holden said gently, his voice thick with overwhelming emotion. "My name is Detective David Holden. You are completely safe now. We are here to take you home." The woman slowly lowered her hands, her eyes adjusting to the dim light of the hallway. She stared at the men in uniform, her chest heaving as she struggled to comprehend what was happening. She looked up at Detective Holden, tears immediately spilling over her pale cheeks, cutting clean lines through the dirt on her face. "My name is Nora," she whispered, her voice cracking with the heavy, unimaginable weight of a 15-year nightmare. "My name is Nora Caldwell. Please call my sister. Tell Tessa I am still alive." Holden felt the breath completely leave his lungs. It was an absolute, undeniable miracle. Against all terrifying odds, after 15 years buried in the total darkness of a mountain bunker, Nora Caldwell had survived. While the tactical medics rushed into the cell, gently wrapping Nora in heavy thermal blankets and preparing her for immediate medical transport, a separate, heavily armed tactical team was positioned 10 miles away in a quiet suburban neighborhood. At exactly 5:15 in the morning, the front door of Garrett Hayes's modest, two-story house was violently blown off its hinges. Stun guns flashed, and heavily armed officers flooded the living room, sweeping the bedrooms in a matter of seconds. Garrett Hayes, the 60-year-old mechanic who had hidden his monstrous nature in plain sight, was pulled from his bed, thrown face down onto the carpet, and heavily handcuffed before he even realized what was happening. Garrett tried to play the role of the confused, innocent citizen. He demanded to know why his house was being raided, threatening to call his lawyers and screaming about police brutality. But when the police captain walked into the bedroom, holding up a clear plastic evidence bag containing the glossy Polaroid photographs found under the concrete trench, all the arrogant, furious color instantly drained from Garrett's face. He knew the heavy, soundproof walls of his mountain fortress had finally been breached. The monster had been completely exposed to the light. Back at the Roanoke Police Precinct, Tessa Caldwell was sitting in the quiet briefing room, staring blankly at the wall. The styrofoam cup of coffee in her hands had gone completely cold hours ago. Her mind was a chaotic, terrifying whirlwind of worst-case scenarios. The heavy door of the briefing room slowly opened. The police captain walked in, his face completely unreadable. He asked Tessa to stand up. "Tessa," the captain said gently, his voice shaking slightly. "Detective Holden just called from the mountain." Tessa felt her knees begin to buckle. She squeezed her eyes shut, preparing for the devastating news she had been dreading for 15 years. "They found the bunker," the captain continued, taking a step closer. "And Tessa, she is alive. They found Nora. She is on her way to the hospital right now." Tessa simply collapsed. The captain caught her before she hit the floor, guiding her gently into a chair. A sound of absolute, overwhelming shock tore from Tessa's throat, a deep, agonizing, beautiful cry of total release. 15 years of carrying the suffocating weight of an unsolved mystery, 15 years of tending to dying plants, 15 years of tying green ribbons to street lamps, it all culminated in a single, miraculous sentence. Her little sister was coming home. The police immediately drove Tessa to the regional medical center. The emergency floor was completely locked down, swarming with police officers and federal agents to protect the survivor. When Tessa arrived, she was escorted by a team of nurses down a quiet, brightly lit corridor toward a private recovery room. Tessa stopped at the doorway, her hands shaking violently. She took a deep breath, pushing the heavy wooden door open. Nora was sitting up in the hospital bed, hooked up to intravenous fluids and wrapped in warm, heated blankets. The bright fluorescent lights of the hospital room were turned down low to protect her sensitive eyes. When the door opened, Nora turned her head. For a long, incredible moment, the two sisters just stared at each other. The 22-year-old girl Tessa remembered had been replaced by a 37-year-old woman whose face carried the heavy, deep scars of profound trauma. But behind the pale skin and the silver-streaked hair, Tessa saw the exact same bright, gentle eyes that had always loved the rain and the flowers. "Nora," Tessa choked out, stepping into the room. "Tessa," Nora whispered, reaching her trembling hand out from beneath the blankets. Tessa ran to the side of the bed, throwing her arms around her sister, burying her face in Nora's shoulder. They held each other with a desperate, crushing intensity, weeping openly, entirely lost in the absolute miracle of their reunion. The years of separation, the darkness, the terror, it all melted away in the warmth of that single, beautiful embrace. "I knew you wouldn't stop looking," Nora cried, her hands gripping the back of Tessa's shirt. "I held on. I just kept telling myself you were still looking for me." As Nora slowly began the long, difficult process of physical and psychological recovery, the horrifying, complete truth of Garrett Hayes' crimes was finally brought to light. Garrett was a deeply sadistic predator who hunted completely in the shadows. He preyed on vulnerable women, tracking them for weeks before making his move. On the night of the massive thunderstorm in 2003, Garrett had been watching Nora work alone in the main office. He had purchased a disposable cell phone with cash specifically for this moment. He hid in the dark shadows of Greenhouse 4, waiting for her to lock the door. When he saw her safely inside her running vehicle, he dialed her number. When Nora answered, Garrett falsely claimed to be a severely injured employee who had been trapped under a fallen pallet inside the dark greenhouse. He begged for her help. Nora, possessing a kind and completely gentle heart, didn't hesitate. She threw her car door open and ran into the storm to help him. Garrett ambushed her in the darkness, ripping the silver necklace from her throat to silence her screams, and dragged her through the mud into the back of his waiting cargo van. He took her to the underground fallout shelter. For 15 years, he kept her completely isolated in the dark. He provided just enough food and water to keep her alive, viewing her not as a human being, but as a prized possession in his sick, terrifying collection. When he realized that Detective Holden and the police were beginning to ask questions about the property, he panicked. He buried the metal lockbox filled with his horrifying Polaroid photographs under the concrete floor of the greenhouse, believing it would hide his history forever. But Garrett had deeply underestimated the incredible, quiet resilience of Nora Caldwell. When the police asked Nora how she had managed to survive for 15 years in total darkness without losing her mind, she gave an answer that brought tears to Detective Holden's eyes. She survived by relying on the exact same patience she used to grow her rare flowers. Nora explained that she retreated deep into her own mind, treating her survival like tending to a delicate plant in the middle of a harsh winter. She conserved her energy. She marked the passage of time by counting her own heartbeat. She recited the Latin names of every single plant she had ever studied, building massive, beautiful, vibrant gardens entirely within her imagination. She refused to give the monster the satisfaction of breaking her spirit. She simply outlasted him, waiting patiently in the dark for the winter to finally break. The legal consequences for Garrett Hayes were absolute and incredibly swift. Faced with the undeniable physical evidence in the bunker, the Polaroid photographs, and the powerful, devastating testimony of his surviving victim, Garrett's defense team completely collapsed. The police also used the photographs to locate the hidden graves of 3 other young women buried deep in the mountain woods surrounding the bunker. Garrett Hayes had been a serial killer for decades. To avoid the death penalty, Garrett pleaded guilty to all charges, including multiple counts of first-degree murder, kidnapping, and false imprisonment. He was sentenced to 4 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. He was transferred to a maximum security federal penitentiary, destined to spend the rest of his natural life locked in a small, concrete cell, entirely stripped of the power and control he had craved so deeply. The anonymous concrete contractor who had made the mysterious phone call to Detective Holden passed away from lung cancer just 3 weeks after the rescue. He never lived to see the trial, but he died knowing that his final act on Earth had completely saved a woman's life and brought a monster to justice. The recovery process for Nora was incredibly long and difficult. Re-entering a world that had moved forward by 15 years was a massive, overwhelming challenge. She had to relearn how to be comfortable in crowded rooms, and she required months of physical therapy to rebuild the strength in her muscles. But she was never alone for a single second. Tessa was right by her side, guiding her through every difficult step, fiercely protecting her peace. On a bright, beautiful spring morning, exactly 1 year after she was pulled from the underground bunker, Nora felt strong enough to finally walk outside on her own. Tessa drove her into downtown Roanoke. They pulled up in front of a small, beautiful storefront with a painted green sign. Tessa unlocked the front door and gently led her sister inside. The small shop was a massive, vibrant explosion of color and life. Hundreds of hanging ferns, delicate orchids, and rich, dark soil filled the room. The air smelled of damp earth and blooming jasmine. But sitting directly in the center of the wooden front counter, placed perfectly in a ray of bright morning sunlight, was a massive, beautiful pot filled with rare, stunningly vibrant blue hydrangeas. Nora walked slowly toward the counter, her eyes completely filled with tears. She reached out, her trembling fingers gently touching the soft blue petals. She looked around the shop, seeing the incredible, beautiful tribute her sister had built to keep her memory alive for all those years. Tessa walked up behind her, wrapping her arms warmly around Nora's shoulders. They stood together in the quiet shop, surrounded by the quiet rustle of the green leaves. The story of the young woman who vanished in a violent summer storm, only to be found 15 years later because of a mysterious phone call, became a defining piece of history for the Blue Ridge Mountains. It was a terrifying reminder that absolute monsters do exist, hiding behind friendly smiles and quiet suburban lawns, waiting patiently in the shadows. But it was also a profound, unforgettable testament to the enduring, unstoppable power of hope. It proved that the human spirit is infinitely stronger than the darkest concrete walls. A monster can lock a young woman in the dark. He can bury the evidence deep beneath the earth, and he can silence the truth for over a decade. But true resilience, much like a seed planted in the dead of winter, cannot be destroyed by the cold. It waits, it gathers strength in the silence, and eventually it always breaks through the soil, reaching desperately for the light, proving that even after the darkest, longest night, the sun will always rise again.